Hi guys, hope everyone's well and welcome back to the Improvement Podcast. So in this episode I'm going to touch on volume and why you should stop stressing about training volume. It seems to be the hot topic at the moment for whatever reason, and everyone wants kind of a black and white answer of how much volume they should do, or in other words, how much sets they should do per exercise. So this episode I'm going to kind of talk through my thoughts regarding training volume and why I think it's heavily overrated and why people stress too much about training volume instead of other variables. So first of all, quick update on myself. So I'm currently just about 3.5 weeks out, which is super exciting. I think if I'm being super specific, 26 days out. So yeah, prep's flown by, to be fair. I started at 30 weeks out, and that might seem quite extreme and quite a lot of time to diet for, but especially when you're getting extremely lean, which is my goal, you do need to give yourself a lot of time because you won't always kind of plan to, or you won't always lose at the rate you plan to lose at. Not only that, but the fact that when you're dieting and you're getting lean, you don't want to lose at the same rate as, let's say, peak bulk. So you want to lose at a slower rate so you don't compromise your ability to retain your muscle tissue and retain your performance. So yeah, it's been a really smooth prep so far. And I think last time, due to having to push quite hard and be quite aggressive, it was like obviously this prep's hard, but I know what it's like. So yes, it's difficult in the grand scheme of things, you could say, but I've done it before, so I know I can kind of do it again. And it's a case of like every day is obviously like or most days have its kind of difficult moments, and it's not the fact of getting through the day, it's knowing that you've got it's doing that every single day, day in, day out. That's maybe the tricky part. So yeah, prep's going well, prep's going smoothly, and I'm excited for my shows. And as for the podcast as well, sorry if you've been kind of waiting on the next episode coming out, if applicable anyway, if you tune in regularly. Sorry for the kind of less frequent uploads. I've just been absolutely hectic with online coaching, personal training, and also managing my prep alongside that. So the podcast sadly doesn't take a priority as much as I love doing it because it doesn't pay the bill, sadly. But I'll be trying to put them out as frequently as I possibly can. So jumping on to the training topic or the episode topic of volume. So everyone wants to know how much sets is best, how much sets they should be doing, and they overly focus on that because there's a lot of things influencing training volume. So you can't give a black and white answer. You can't give an answer saying you should do X amount of sets, which I'll get to. So a ton of factors will influence how much volume you can do in the gym, and some of them are being effort. So for example, if you take a set to absolute failure versus if you leave a set 1 rep in the tank, 2 rep in the tank, then that volume is not equal, which is a problem with asking how much volume you should do, because I don't know people's training effort. I don't know people's training intensity. So I can't really give you a set amount of volume you should do. Also, something to consider is even if your perceived effort is the same, let's say someone goes into a set, they're not really aroused, meaning they're not kind of amping themselves up for it at all, versus someone goes in a set full of aggression, full of absolute rage, like getting themselves as psyched up as they possibly can, your ability to perform will change, but both those sets are to failure, if that makes sense. So again, the closer we train to failure and the more reps we get close to failure, the more stimulative reps we will get. So if, let's say, you've got more stimulative reps due to training closer to failure, then that's going to mean you'll need less volume per exercise, or sorry, per muscle group per week, you could say, or per session. And as well as that, like the exercise itself will affect things. So if you are doing an exercise with like a different range of motion than another, that might influence things as well. What I mean by that is, let's say you're doing a movement where you're getting an extreme stretch. So when you get a good stretch, that will produce a bit more muscle damage than if, let's say, you didn't. For example, like a leg extension, you don't get that much stretch, and I don't think it's going to contribute towards as much muscle damage. Same with, let's say, a leg press, because you're not most individuals aren't lengthening their quads as much during a leg press as they would with maybe like a hack squat or a Smith machine squat, that sort of thing. So you've got to consider like the range of motion you're working throughout an exercise. That will influence how much, again, muscle damage will occur and how much maybe volume you'll need accordingly, or volume you can at least recover from accordingly. And what I mean by recover from is you want to make sure you're not doing too much that by the time you get into your next session, you're not sore again. That's one of the things we're looking for in terms of how much volume we should do per session. And that's going to be influenced by obviously how often you train a body part. If someone's training a body part once a week versus 2 to 3 times a week, then they want less sets per overall session because they know they've got only 3 sleeps until they're next training that body part. So next up is a resistance profile of a movement. So the resistance profile is basically like where the movement is hard and where the movement is easy. And an example is, let's say you're doing a hack squat with no band versus a hack squat with a band. Or let's say you're doing a dumbbell press that heavily loads that stretch position versus a chest fly that doesn't have a lot of tension in the stretch. Or another example could be like a dumbbell press versus a machine press where the machine's quite light in the bottom and heavy at the top, whereas the dumbbell's the opposite. So again, if let's say we are doing a movement which has a resistance profile that's more favoured in the stretch, that could produce a bit more kind of muscle damage and it could stimulate muscle growth a bit more effectively accordingly. And that brings me on to like a point, like if you are wanting to increase the amount of work you're doing, you could increase it through movements that aren't super heavy in the stretch if you're trying to get more work done, because again, it's not going to give you as much muscle damage. So although there's a lot of kind of evidence research saying, right, the stretch is a valuable part of the movement, if let's say you're training a movement super frequent or training a muscle group super frequently, you might not want that soreness, you might not want that muscle damage, you might not want to basically make yourself sore for that long for that reason. Also, like, it's more fatiguing when you get like a bit of a greater stretch, so that's something to consider. And also, not only like if you're getting a good stretch during a movement, but like if you've got access to, if you've not seen on Instagram, like the Prime gym equipment, which is equipment where you can choose exactly where you load the machines, so where you make it hard, where you make it easy, basically manipulate the resistance profile. Or if you're just picking an exercise that has a really good resistance profile, meaning it's super, super hard from the very, very start to the very, very end of the exercise, that's different doing a set to failure with a movement like that versus a movement like maybe a chest supported dumbbell row where it's really light at the bottom in the middle position, or like a plate loaded row machine where it's really heavy at the top and really light in the stretch. Like if you do your last full rep to failure on both of those machines, and then let's say one of the movements it's extremely hard throughout the full range, so from the movement you start the rep from the moment you start the rep to the end of the rep, let's say it's extremely slow and extremely hard throughout the full range, versus if let's say you do a dumbbell row where it's just really hard at the top but still really light at the bottom. Again, those sets to failure are not equal. Not all sets to failure are created equal. You've also got to consider like how continuous are your sets are. Like if you are, let's say, doing a set to failure on, take any movement, like let's say a hack squat, good example, or any sort of squat variation, and you take no rest at the top but you do it to failure, then that's different from doing a set, making it nice and continuous, meaning not resting at the top, and then after you can't get any more, then resting at the top for, let's say, 2 to 3 seconds, and then going for a few more reps. You could argue that the sets that are a bit less continuous, you're getting more effective reps because you are drawing out the set further. You're extending the set further through taking longer rest periods throughout. So again, are those sets equal? Definitely not. And also like bracing. So if you're doing a movement that's not in that stable environment, like let's say a bent over barbell row, yes, you'll train your upper back, but what if your lower back is actually the limiting factor? So you're not actually training your upper back to failure to the same degree as doing a chest supported row. So again, are those sets equal? In my opinion, definitely not. Same with, let's say, if you're doing a walk and lunge or like a free weight squat versus a machine based leg movement. Like the movement where you're machine based, you're going to be more stable, which will allow you to produce more force. Like we need to. A good saying is stability is a prerequisite to strength, meaning if we are not stable, we can be strong. So whenever we're thinking about, right, how can we get more out of our movements in the gym, you always want to think about, right, how can I make myself more stable? And you can do so by bracing internally through basically using your breath to create more stability, through doing things in terms of your execution, and also with like machines, for example, when there's a contact point, use it. Meaning when you can have a handle to grab, when you can strap yourself up, when you can use a chest support, when you can use any other contact point with the machine, that will create further stability. So we want to utilize and capitalize on that to make us as stable as possible, so that again we can produce more force. And also, like I touched on, like what's the limiting factor during a movement? So if let's say you're doing a barbell squat but your lower back and your glutes give out before your quads, that's not the equivalent of doing a hack squat where your quads give out first to failure. Granted, the effort's obviously the same on both sets. So as you can see, there's so much variables that impact training volume. I could go on and think of a lot more, but I think you get like even like the place in the session the movement is could affect things. And as a result, like you can't give black and white answers on how much volume you should do and how much sets are best. And also something to consider as well is it a compo movement or an isolation movement? Like if someone's asking, or if someone's looking at a training study and they're saying, oh, they've done X amount of sets per muscle group, 50 sets per muscle group, what are they classing as a set for a muscle group? For example, if you're training your triceps, would a barbell bench press count as training volume for your triceps? Would doing, let's say, a Smith machine squat count as training volume for your erectors, or a Romanian deadlift count as training volume for your erectors? And in the studies, are the individuals or participants well trained? Are the participants, let's say, just training upper body if they're only counting sets per upper body per exercise? Because then they're freeing up a lot of recovery from not training their lower body. So there's so much factors influencing training volume, which is why you don't want to give black and white answers, and you shouldn't give black and white answers with training volume for that reason. And as for a few influences on how much volume you should do, so you want to make sure that you're doing an amount that you enjoy and you can adhere to over the long term that suits your lifestyle. For example, if you are an individual that have, let's say, quite a high stress job, and you, let's say, don't sleep that well and you've not got a lot of time, then you probably won't be able to adhere to doing the same amount of work as someone who, let's say, bodybuilds full time or has a job that's very, very low stress that allows them to recover from more, versus someone who maybe does like a manual handling job. So you want to consider, right, how much can you personally recover from, how much actually fits your routine and your schedule, because I'd argue doing less overall work but having better sleep quality, having better stress management, and having better quality work in the gym from doing less is gonna influence your, or it's gonna improve your results in comparison to someone who just does the same amount of training volume as someone they look up to online because they see them do it, if that makes sense. And like I said, what do you enjoy? Like, a lot of approaches work. There's many ways to skin a cat when it comes to training. So if you find that you like doing like a lower volume approach and maybe training more frequently, or if you just like doing less overall sets and training super hard throughout those sets, and that allows you to get into the gym more frequently due to enjoying it more, then that's the right path for you to go down, if that makes sense. So we should factor enjoyment in. Also, like, focus. Like, if we do like a crazy amount of work per session, how well is the quality of that work towards the end of the session? Because we're not just doing a box ticking exercise. We're trying to not just do work but quality work. So that's something we also want to consider. Like, how's our focus? How's our effort as the session goes on? And like I said, recovery, which I'll get to. And what I also briefly touched on earlier is frequency. So the more frequently you train a body part, the less overall sets you can do per session. If someone, let's say, trains legs once a week, they can get away with doing a lot of work because they don't need to train for another, you know what I mean, they've got another 7 sleeps until their next leg day, whereas someone who trains like 2 times a week, and they've got half the amount of time to recover, which means they've got less overall time to do training volume, or not less overall time, they've got less overall time to recover from that training volume. So you want to consider how frequently you're training a muscle group. So when your frequency is higher, your overall work per session is going to be lower. And this is something I probably should have prefaced at the start, but training volume is simply the amount of sets you do at the gym, if I didn't mention. So if you've got this far in and you're still wondering what I mean by volume, I do apologise. But yeah, just to clarify, volume is the amount of work or sets you're doing in the gym. And also, like, if you're training a muscle group once per week, then if, let's say, you are concerned about a certain amount of volume, then regardless of, let's say, when you're next training the body part, or regardless if you're sore or not a few days after, then you could argue you could get away with doing more just so you're doing overall more work throughout that week for that body part if you can recover from it. So some considerations we want to take in mind when it comes to training volume is also what the dose response is. So what I mean by that is it's not a linear response you get from training volume. So if, let's say, let's say for legs you do 5 really, really hard sets for quads, then you'll get a lot out of them, whereas the law of diminishing return takes place, meaning the more sets you do, let's say you've done, so when it comes to muscle growth, you kind of stimulate it, and you don't need, let's say, 100, or that's obviously a bit exaggerating. Like, you don't need like tons and tons of sets to stimulate muscle growth. So once you've stimulated muscle growth, the more work you do after that, the less return you kind of get, if that makes sense. And the reason why this is kind of something valuable to consider is, could it be a better idea, maybe, or could this point towards doing like a full body or an upper lower split in terms of being able to stimulate a muscle group to grow more effectively and recover more effectively in comparison to doing, let's say, all your sets in one session? Because if you've ever like trained biceps and your execution's good, your effort's good, it's like after doing like 4 sets of biceps, if I'm including like my high intensity techniques like a drop set, then overall I'll do like 6 sets of biceps for like pull. After that, my arms are absolutely toast. I'm not getting much more out of more sets. So you can consider like the dose response, like I said, like the more you do, the less you get out of the sets you do. So that could lend itself to training a muscle group a bit more frequently. Because if you like absolutely trash your biceps during your sets, then like when you do the 7th set, like you've already got a great pump, you've already got tiredness in your biceps. So do you need that more work, or could you just save that for another session? And I think this is a great reason why beginners and intermediates should do like a full body or upper lower split, because you will basically be able to get more frequent training in per muscle group, which means more opportunities to grow each muscle group, if that makes sense. And with volume as well, you might get, like, some studies might say, oh, the individuals with a higher volume got more results from doing more. They maybe measured them for, let's say they measured them 8 weeks. What happens after that 8 weeks? So we want to consider not just short term what leads to better results, but long term what leads to better results, because we're in this for the long game. You can only build so much muscle in the space of 8 weeks. So one, maybe the difference in results in muscle growth could be partly just from inflammation from training that certain muscle group. So it might not actually be they built more muscle. And what I mean by inflammation is when you train like a muscle, like the area gets inflamed, you might hold water in that area, which could and the muscle can be kind of swelled, which could indicate the muscle's larger in size when it may not actually be. So yeah, you might get more results short term from more volume, but something to consider is like wear and tear. So the more sets you do, the more wear and tear you're putting on your joints. So yes, you might get away with it for a shorter period of time, but over time that will accumulate. And maybe your joints will get a bit too battered from doing more work. And if that leads to you not being able to train a body part effectively due to being injured or having any sort of pain, then is that optimal on paper, regardless if more volume gives you more? And also fatigue. So yes, doing more volume per session for a short period of time might give you better results, but your body will, like, for example, if you train and you do a ton of work one session, your body's fatigued from that work the day after, even 2 days after that. So fatigue you accumulate over time. So if you're doing more work, then you're going to accumulate more fatigue. And that volume you might be able to recover from, but as you get stronger and stronger, as you get more advanced and you're able to not only lift heavier loads but also train harder, and that's going to lead to basically accumulating more fatigue throughout your session, which could lead to, again, needing to deload super frequent, which can be counterproductive, which will impact your ability to perform in subsequent sessions. Because when we're fatigued, when we've got, let's say, muscle damage, generally just when we are in a fatigued state, our ability to produce force will be lower, which means we can't get as much out of our sets, we can't recruit as much muscle fibers, again, affecting our ability to progress over the long term. You've also got to consider, like, burning out, like, what can you do and stick to and what can you adhere? Like, even if I told you, right, doing 50 sets a session to failure is going to produce the best results, it doesn't really matter if that's going to produce the best results or not if someone's on a time crunch and they've only got 4 times a week to train and they've, let's say, got other commitments outside the gym, high stress, then they're probably going to burn out regardless if that's optimal or not. And again, what gives us results is consistency over the long term. You've also got nowhere to kind of increase it to. So what happens when lifts then plateau or you stop seeing like a response per muscle group? If you've already maxed out the amount of volume you're doing, then you can't really increase it anymore. You're kind of screwed there. You can obviously look at other things to get more out of your sets, but I think getting more out of less can be a good idea for wear and tear in your joints, fatigue, not burning out, and also just so you've got somewhere to then increase it to as well. And like I said, because like the dose response isn't linear, the more sets you do per session, it's like once you've stimulated muscle growth, you've chapped on the door, you've told your body, right, it's time to build muscle. If you keep chapping on the door, like they've already answered, they've already opened the door, like muscle growth's already going to be stimulated. So what are you doing that's going to be beneficial with doing more work on top of that, if that makes sense? So that's why I prefer maybe not doing a super low volume approach, and again, not being in one camp or the other, not having one approach or the other, but just not taking the mick with training volume or not trying to push it ridiculously high, if that makes sense. And also, how do we know if we are doing enough training volume? What are some good indicators to look at? So I give full credit to kind of Mike Israetel for coming up with these kind of, or some of these landmarks in terms of how much volume you should do. He's who I kind of heard it from, but we want to consider, like, if we've got a pump, if we, let's say, finish a session and we've got no pump at all in a certain muscle group, then that's a sign we could probably maybe do a bit more work. And even if, let's say, regardless if, let's say, you have done, or regardless how much work you're doing, I think every exercise, depends on the rep range to an extent, you should get some form of pump on, if that makes sense. Like if you're getting off a machine or you're getting off doing any movement and you've got no feeling of pump in the target muscle, then unless it's a super low rep range, then you probably could have targeted that muscle a bit more effectively or got more out of that set somehow. So that's a good sign if we're doing not only enough work, but if the quality of our work's good. Like if we get off a leg extension and our quads are absolutely rammed full of blood, they feel wrecked, they feel wobbly, then that's a sign we've targeted them well. Whereas if we get off and our knees are crying at us, but we don't feel it in our quads, and that's a sign that that work probably wasn't high quality. So again, are we getting a pump, which is basically when you get tons of blood flowing to the muscle and the muscle kind of feels tight and feels kind of inflated, if that makes sense. You've also got fatigue. So if, let's say, you train a muscle group and then let's say you're training your shoulders, and then on the way home, as you're driving your car, you can barely keep your hands up on the steering wheel because they're that battered and fatigued. So if they've got that much kind of disruption or fatigue present, then that's probably a sign you've done a decent amount of work in that session for that body part. We can also look at soreness. So soreness is also an indicator of if we've done a sufficient amount of work or too much work. For example, if we're sore going into our next session, then we've probably done too much work. However, if let's say going into the next session, or let's say the day after training, we'll go with legs because legs are a more common body part to get sore. Let's say we're training our quads and the day after, they don't feel sore in absolute slightest. They don't feel heavy or tired or achy at all. Then if legs are your weaker body part, then you could definitely get away with doing more work for that muscle group. So that's something we also look at. How sore is maybe a muscle getting? And then if it's not sore before the next session, that could be a reason we could maybe look to add more. And as you can see, like it's impossible for me to give an exact number just due to all these factors. Also progression as well, sorry. So if let's say your lifts are flying up, then that's a good sign you're doing like appropriate amount of work. And I think something valuable is it's always easy to look for what's optimal, what's going to produce the best results. Whereas if something's working, just run with it. You don't always need to change it, because I think sometimes people can get paralysis by analysis and they think, oh, this could be better, that could be better. And it just leads them to constantly changing their training, constantly changing their movements, not actually allowing them time to get strong, and not actually running something for an extended period of time to see if it actually produces results or not. So I think just keeping things the same can be good for that reason. And next up, to conclude, the final thing I want to touch on is what should you maybe focus on instead of volume. Obviously, I've touched on how do you know you're doing enough, so take that in mind. And yes, consider training volume. You don't want to not consider it at all, but it shouldn't be the forefront of your focus. I think there's things you can focus on before obsessing over training volume. Like if you look at all the individuals who are massive, look at all the biggest individuals on the planet in terms of bodybuilders. What do they all have in common? They all do different amounts of volume. They all do different amounts of sets per exercise. They all train in different ways, but they're all strong. So success leaves clues in that regard. Like if we're looking at the individuals who have the best physiques, the most muscle tissue on the planet, they are people that are also the strongest. So that indicates that volume shouldn't be the main driver towards our decision making, or volume's not the main driver towards muscle growth and progress. It is the quality of the work we're doing. So I always think doing quality over quantity is absolutely key. So have a focus on that instead, like, because it doesn't matter like how much sets it's not, you don't get a badge of honor for doing a certain amount of sets in the gym, and you don't get more results from necessarily doing more. Because if you look at, let's say, the people who do a lot of training volume, who are they? Runners. Do they have massive legs? Usually not. So we should look at when you're thinking about, right, what produces results, look at individuals and see what they all have in common. Don't look at the folk with the best genetics, but look at the folk who do have good results, who've maybe started with poor genetics or struggled to build muscle in the first place, and see what they've done to get to where they are. So yeah, all people do different amounts, so that tells us that it's not the end of the world if you're doing 12 sets or 10 sets. And like I said, it's hard to even know, right, what's the difference between 10 and 12 sets due to a lot of things influencing it. Like, as I touched on earlier, if you're training your back, or let's say you're training your rear delts, and you do that through a row or a rear delt fly, then that volume is definitely not equal. And as well as just focusing on getting strong, focus on your effort, your form, and consistency. I think a lot of people will worry about things like their training volume or things like their training program, but they don't nail those three things. And it's like there's no point focusing on having the perfect exercise order, or having the perfect pre-workout routine, or having the perfect training environment if you're not even getting in a training environment consistently. So prioritize what's going to allow you the best adherence, or in other words, consistency, form, and effort. And as well as that, like, form will make a big impact on your ability to, or on how effective the work you're doing is, and that will affect volume as well. Like if you're doing a set with a really good eccentric, you're bracing well, staying tight, pausing in the stretch, getting a really deep stretch on, let's say, a squat, versus someone who's just bouncing down to parallel and jumping back up, and they're not really, like, their sets are just looking horrific in terms of form. again, those sets aren't going to be equal in terms of the amount of volume they will produce. So also like nailing variables outside the gym. So I believe a lot of people could do that better. Like instead of worrying and sleep and tossing and turning at night about doing 10 sets versus 12 sets per muscle group, why don't you actually get 9 hours sleep instead of sleeping for 6 hours? Often what produces results is doing the boring stuff well over time, but that's not sexy, that's not exciting to talk about. So people instead will look for a magic amount of sets to try and grant them better results, or a magic exercise, whereas it's just about doing the boring stuff very, very well over time. But again, that's not the answer people want to hear, sadly. But again, that's what I think produces better results, like sleeping longer, doing things that will improve your sleep, doing things that will improve your nutrition, eating better around your session rather than the amount of actual volume you're doing in the gym. And hope you enjoyed the episode. If you have any questions, then please let me know. If you made it to the end, then I'd massively appreciate any ratings or reviews on the podcast. It goes such a long way, and I really, really appreciate everyone's support. Until next episode, any questions or anything I can help you with off the back of the episode, feel free to just drop me a message on Instagram and also tell me you enjoyed it. If you did, I'd love to hear that, and I'm more than happy to kind of take on board any recommendations for certain kind of topics that you'd like me to cover. Hope everyone has a great rest of their day.